welcome back to Biblical Greek Made Easy. This is class 9 of module 1, and we're going to keep going with pronouns today, learning demonstrative pronouns / adjectives. And we're in a little bit of a deep dive here, 4 weeks in a row, where we learn all different kinds of pronouns in the Greek language, which are so essential to be able to read and translate the New Testament. So a scripture I want to share with you today, in Luke chapter 19, Jesus goes to the house of Zacchaeus the tax collector. Now the text tells us that he's a chief tax collector, he's important, he's wealthy, but he's a short man and he wants to be able to see Jesus. So he climbs up in a tree so he can see over the crowd, and Jesus sees him and he connects with him and ends up going to Zacchaeus' house. And at the end of that scene, Jesus says in Luke 19:9, he says, "Today salvation has come to this house, because he also is a son of Abraham." Now that phrase, this house, the this there, that's what we're going to learn today, okay? Those demonstrative pronouns where we can say this and we can say that, okay? And so that's what we're going to look at today. And it's cool that in this pronouncement at Zacchaeus' house, we see one of these words show up. And so we need to learn these in order to translate. So here's the tip of the day. The tip of the day is don't slack on cases and endings. Okay, don't slack on cases and endings. Now, we learned cases and endings with nouns a number of classes ago, okay? And we did a deep dive into first declension, second declension nouns, and then later on we learned third declension nouns and those cases and the case endings that go with them and all that kind of stuff. We learned that paradigm that you remember that shows up, and we learn those, and those keep coming up again and again. And you have to prioritize those, you have to memorize those, because they just keep coming up. So today, we're going to learn the two demonstrative pronouns, and they're going to use the same endings. And so if you learned it back then, that's great news. You already know these endings. You don't have to learn something new. All you're doing is applying a new word to the same pattern that you already know, and it's super easy. But if you struggled with it or you didn't learn it back then, here it is again, and we just have to know that. So don't slack on those. Or maybe you knew them pretty well when you did that class, but maybe it's faded a little bit. You want to do some practice to stay up on that, because it's so important. Those cases and those endings keep coming up again and again in the Greek system, okay? So that's the tip of the day. Let me encourage you with that. Let's get right to it. Let's talk about why this matters, okay? So the New Testament contains over 1,600 occurrences of the demonstrative pronouns. That is a lot. They show up a ton, and we need to be aware of that, okay? I've had students before that, for whatever reason, just slacked off on demonstrative pronouns when that unit came around, when that class came around, and it followed them for a while. It followed them all the way through future semesters, because they kind of, for whatever reason, they just weren't able to go back and fill in that gap in their brain. And it's not that complicated, but they're just used so much. If you don't get these, you'll be really struggling in translation. So 1,600 occurrences in the New Testament. Your translation will continue to improve as you learn the usage of these key terms. Okay, because they're a little bit flexible, we're going to see. And we're also going to learn the vocative case at the end. Now, don't be scared of this. You've learned 4 cases already: nominative, genitive, dative, and accusative. The vocative case is not used very often. It's just a little wrinkle that you'll want to be aware of. It can be powerful when it shows up, but it's really pretty simple. We'll talk about that at the end today. So let's start with a little grade school English review. Now, let's talk about demonstratives in English, okay? In English, demonstratives are words like this and these. Those go together. That's singular and plural. Sometimes we think of that as the near demonstrative, right? This and these, you think about it being close to you. And that and those, again, singular and plural of the same, essentially the same word. And sometimes this is known as the far demonstrative. And notice that in that word demonstrative, you see this idea of demonstrate, right? It's you're being clear, you're demonstrating, you're pointing at something, you're declaring something is, using this, these, that, those. Okay, so those are the words in English. Let me give you a few examples. So, that class is my favorite. What are you going to do with those fish sticks with that jalapeno fire sauce on them? Okay. This is tasty. Now, notice that a number of the times these show up, that, those, this, these are all demonstrative pronouns in English, okay? This is how they show up. And those first couple times you see, they're adjectives. And remember what an adjective is? An adjective modifies a noun, okay? An adjective modifies a noun. So when you see one of those demonstrative words paired with a noun, so like that class, the that is modifying class, okay? So it's an adjective. Those fish sticks, the those is modifying fish sticks, okay? So in those cases, it's working as adjectives. At the bottom, though, where we say this is tasty, okay? Notice there's not a noun there. We're not saying this meal is tasty, this cupcake is tasty. We're just saying this is tasty. In that case, it's standing in like a pronoun, okay? So not super important here. Just realize that the demonstratives in English and in Greek, we'll learn in a minute, they can operate as adjectives modifying nouns, or they can work as pronouns standing by themselves, okay? So demonstratives in Greek are very similar, except that they're going to have case and gender. In English, if we say that or those or this, gender isn't included in that, right? We can say this guy or this girl, and we don't change the word. As you probably suspect, in Greek, we are going to have gender be a part of that picture, okay? So when a demonstrative in Greek is a pronoun, it's going to behave like a pronoun. In other words, case is going to come from the function in the sentence, like we would expect, okay? Case is always going to tell us that function in the sentence, okay? Gender and number is going to come from the antecedent. And remember what an antecedent is? It's the word that the pronoun fills in for, okay? So if it's a masculine singular antecedent, then the pronoun, the demonstrative pronoun, is going to be masculine singular, etc. If it's going to be neuter plural, then it's going to be neuter plural, etc. When it's an adjective, it's going to behave like an adjective. In other words, it's going to agree with the noun that it's modifying in case, gender, number, okay? So if we say those fish sticks, okay, notice that those is plural and fish sticks is plural. And if that was in Greek, whatever gender fish sticks were, I don't know off the top of my head. I don't know if they don't talk about fish sticks too often in the New Testament, but whatever that gender was, the demonstrative word is going to match that, okay? So let me show you the paradigm here, okay? Now this is where we get back to that tip of the day. Remember, I said that those cases and endings were not going to go away. Here's the good news as I get ready to show you this paradigm, is that you already know these endings, okay? This is a standard 2-1-2 paradigm, masculine, feminine, and neuter, all four cases, both singular and plural, and that gives us our paradigm right here. And you know all of these endings, okay? It looks exactly like the definite article, just with a different front on it, okay? It looks exactly like the logos paradigm, with just different stuff going on the front, okay? Now, as you look at this, notice that almost all of them start with what letter? Yeah, tau. You see that? Okay, so we get hutas, we'll come back to that in a second, but you see tutu, tuto, tuton, and then hutoi we'll talk about in a second, and then tuton, tutois, tutus, okay? That's our masculine demonstrative of hutas. Now notice that the nominative singular for masculine and feminine and the nominative plural for masculine and feminine, they don't start with taus, they start with vowels instead. But notice that all four of those have rough breathing marks, okay? So all of these are going to start with either a tau or a rough breathing mark, okay? So that first one there, hutas, we saw. Hutoi, that's going to be, this and these as, as our nominative masculines. And then we have haute and hautai as our feminine versions of those, okay? Once again, in the neuter, we see some repetition. Tuta and nominative neuter singular, and tuta again, neuter accusative singular. Then notice in the nominative plural there, tauta and tauta, once again, the same for the plural. Okay, so we call this the hutas paradigm, because remember, we always go top left for our lexical form, if possible. In this case, hutas is our lexical form if we needed to look it up. but you see the full conjugation there, okay? Now, let me show you the other one. The next one is actually a little bit simpler. It's called a kainos, and this is the one that's going to be that or those. Let me show you that right now. And once again, as you look up and down that paradigm, pretty straightforward, right? A kainos, a kainu, a kaino, a kainon, a kainoi, a kainon, a kainois, a kainus, etc. Okay? That epsilon, kappa, epsilon, iota, nu, that is the same for every single one of them. And then we just have endings on the end. Okay? So again, if you know these cases and endings, should be pretty straightforward. All we're doing is changing the front end. It's just like learning a new noun or a new adjective that has these full conjugations here, okay? So this is how you say that or those. Now, a couple thoughts, particularly with these pronouns, okay? The particularities. There's not many. These are pretty regular, okay? So take heart in that. Hutas always begins with a rough breathing mark or a tau. We mentioned that before. Hutas or tutu as two examples. Mounts in the book, if you're reading the chapter, you'll notice that he says to think of these as interchangeable, okay? I don't know if that's helpful for you or not, but just as those letters kind of relate to each other, rough breathing and tau, you can maybe think of those as interchangeable. And if that's true, essentially we have the same idea starting each of these words. That's never been the most helpful fact in the world to me, but something to keep in mind. Also, if used as a pronoun, you may need to add a word in translation. In other words, Greek is going to use hutas and akainos more than we would in English. Okay, so the example that you see here, hutas estai megas. This, or this guy, will be great. This will be great, okay? We might say this will be great, but not probably if we were talking about a person, right? So to make sense in English, we're going to need to say this person, this man, this boy will be great. Why am I using masculine examples for all of those? Because hutas is masculine, okay? If it was haute, it would be she or this girl or this woman will be great, something like that. Notice we're supplying whatever that noun isn't actually showing up in the sentence. We're needing to supply it so it makes sense in English, okay? Now, another word of warning here. The word that in English is rather flexible, okay? We use that to talk about a bunch of different things. So, for example, we might say, Jesus said that the meek shall inherit the earth, or something like that, okay? That is not a demonstrative. That use of that is not a demonstrative, okay? That's actually the Greek word hati, which you should already know from a vocabulary sense. Hati means that sense because. It can also be kind of the introduction of a quote, like we just did there. Jesus said, comma, quotation mark. Those quotation marks don't exactly show up in Greek, at least not in ancient Koine Greek. And so that hati kind of introduces a quote. But that's not that Jesus said that's not a demonstrative. Demonstrative is only when we say like that guy, that person, those people, etc. It's kind of like pointing, right? That's how you can think about demonstrative, okay? Also, if I said something like, the guy that stole my Bible at the coffee shop or something, the guy that stole, that version of that, also not a demonstrative, okay? That's a relative pronoun, which we're going to talk about next class period, okay? But that's, by the way, this is English's fault, not Greek's fault, okay? Because English uses this word that a whole bunch of different ways, and one of those ways is a demonstrative pronoun, but it's not the only way that it uses it, okay? So we have to make sure that our English is really buttoned up here so that we don't get those confused, okay? Now let's talk about the vocative case real quick. Okay, the vocative is the fifth and final case that we'll learn. There's not a secret sixth and seventh cases out there, okay? It's the fifth and final case. It's by far the least common in the New Testament. All the other ones show up a ton. Vocative is much, much less, okay? It's a really specific usage, and it's really the case of direct address. The case of direct address. Now, what do we mean by that? Let's look at an example, okay? You see the example here. Hu pas ha lagon moi. Not all the ones who say to me, and then keep going here, Kyrie, Kyrie, eis elusatai, eis tein basileon ton uranon. Okay? Not all the ones who say to me, Lord, Lord, will enter into the kingdom of heaven. I want you to notice the Kyrie there. That's a form of kurios, which is a word you know, which means Lord, exactly, okay? So Kyrie, Kyrie is a case that you don't know, but it's a word you do know. This is in the vocative form, and it's direct address. Notice, Jesus is talking here, and he's quoting someone saying to him, Lord, Lord. Since it's direct address, it's calling Jesus by the title Lord, so for that case, we use the vocative, okay? You might think of it as like the English word sir or ma'am or something like that. It's just a polite way to address someone, okay? So in the plural, the vocative is always going to be the same as the nominative plural. Okay, so that's really easy, is that the nominative is going to stand in if there's a direct address, and we're just going to understand that we don't need an extra case. We're just going to use the nominative for the vocative in those times, okay? So anytime a nominative plural is used as a direct address, it's essentially the vocative case. We understand that as direct address vocative case, okay? Don't worry too much about that. The same is for the first declension singular, okay? So that feminine singular is just going to be the nominative singular, okay? So gune means woman. If you're going to say, speak to a woman, you'd say gune, woman, gune, woman, woman, that sort of thing. And that's a polite address. Jesus calls his mom woman at the wedding at Cana, and that's a vocative. That's a direct address. That's nominative standing in for an address of the vocative. Okay. Now the second declension, masculine and neuter, it's going to add an epsilon on the end, and that's what we saw before. And Kyrie is going to be the most famous place that this shows up. If you're addressing someone as Lord, or if characters in the Bible call Jesus Lord or something like that, that's how you're going to see it. And it becomes Kyrie. That epsilon shows up on the end. Okay? And then finally, third declension is probably the place that it's the most weird. And the third declension, it's usually just going to drop the ending, or sometimes it might change the vowel at the end. So for example, pater with an eta rho at the end is the normal nominative masculine singular version of father, okay? If we change that eta rho to an epsilon rho, we get pater instead of pater, and again, that's just that subtle little change that just signals the vocative to us. Now again, don't worry about this too much. Don't think you need to memorize this in mass or print out a list of all the vocatives in the New Testament or anything like that. We don't need to get that we don't need to get carried away with this. I just want you to be aware that vocative is something that shows up from time to time, and we want to be able to recognize it when we see it. Or if you're encountering in a commentary or something, if they mention the vocative, I just want you to have a category for what that looks like. Okay? Now, let's do a little review. We learned demonstrative pronouns and demonstrative adjectives today, okay? And those in Greek are hutos and akanos. Hutos means this, akanos means that, okay? And we learned that the way those work as both pronouns and adjective. If it's by itself, standing in for a noun, it's a pronoun. If it's connected with a noun, if it's modifying a noun, then it's an adjective, like we've already seen. Okay? And then we also learned the vocative case. That's the last thing we learned today here. There's a fifth case that's used when there's a direct address to someone in Greek, like Kyrie, Kyrie, Lord, Lord, or a handful of other examples in the New Testament. Again, we don't want to go crazy learning all the examples necessarily. We just want to know what vocative is. We want to be able to see it if it shows up. And actually, many times, it just uses the nominative form. For the plural and for the first declension singular, it's just going to use the nominative form. That's how vocative is going to show up. All right, guys, great job on demonstratives today. We're going to come back next week, and we've got one more chapter of our deep dive on pronouns, and we're going to learn relative pronouns next time. And then we're done with Module 1. We get to transition on to Module 2 and verbs. So you're not going to want to miss it. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.